Good morning, afternoon, evening, and welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents, a new offering on Village TV. Concerned Citizens of Laguna Woods is an organization committed to peace, social justice, economic equality, and a clean environment. For the duration of the lockdown, instead of its usual 2 meetings a month, Concerned Citizens will broadcast 2 programs a month on this channel. Our programs will feature films, lectures, and debates on topics related to our mission. We hope you enjoy today's program.
Welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents. My name is Suzanne Modell. I'm chair of the Concerned Citizens Program Committee, which is responsible for planning these broadcasts. Today, September 28th, 2020, our committee is pleased to present Jennifer Merolla, professor of political science at UC Riverside. In her research, Professor Merolla has devoted attention to some unusual determinants of voting behavior, especially terrorist threat, in particular 9/11 and the war on terror, gender. She's taken a look at Sarah Palin as well as Hillary Clinton, and the interaction of the two. For instance, does a military crisis affect voters' preference for a male or female candidate? Professor Merolla has also studied the effects of political speech on support for candidates and support for policies. She holds a PhD from Duke and is co-author of 2 books, Democracy at Risk, How Terrorist Threats Affect the Public, and Framing Immigrants, News Coverage, Public Opinion, and Policy, both from very illustrious presses, I might add. Dr. Merolla has agreed to answer our questions about the upcoming election. Welcome, Jennifer Merolla.
Thank you so much.
You are an expert on the effect of crises on elections. Here in the US, we experience a new crisis every few days. COVID, police brutality, climate change, forest fires, Supreme Court battles, tax revelations. Overall, which of these or set of these do you feel are most important for the upcoming election?
Now that's a great question. And I would have to really lead with the current pandemic. I mean, this is something that is unlike many crises, right? So in the past, I've studied a lot on national security crises, but the kind of direct threat that people may feel is, usually pretty removed unless you lived in areas that were, kind of directly under threat or were attacked after 9/11. For most people, it was just a big existential threat to the country. But something like the current pandemic, that's really affected, everyone in this country, in ways both big and small. And so it really is on the minds of many voters. It's cited as the most important concern. If you look at, current polling, it really leads the pack. And what's related to that concern, of course, is the economy, because, the current economic downturn is in large part because of the current pandemic. And so, I think it's really unavoidable. It will be really important in people's voting decisions.
Do you have a sense about how it might affect the outcome?
Well, that still remains to be seen. It's really tricky in the sense, so we have these crises. People are really, concerned about them. They're thinking quite a bit about them and how they affect their daily lives. But this is all in the context of an era of really high partisan polarization. And so, the number one determinant of someone's vote is going to be their party identification. That is, generally, in at least the last several election cycles, 90% or more of people who identify with a political party end up voting for their party's candidate. And so kind of everything else kind of might push people at the margins, those who are weaker partisans, or people who are independent and don't identify with one of the parties. And so at least with some of the, polling, if we want to think about how the current pandemic may affect those voters, right, who are more likely to, kind of shift their decision making. it's something that really, isn't good for the incumbent. Anytime there's a
Aha,
crisis
aha.
where the economy, is in downturn, where there's, we haven't had a major health crisis like this in modern, right, elections. But if you just look at some of the polling, a majority of the US public doesn't approve of Trump's handling of the virus. And this is the case among not just Democrats, but also independents, really. So it's just Republicans who, continue to approve of his handling of the pandemic. But those voters who are more likely to shift in the context of the election really have a negative view of the way he's handled the pandemic.
Oh, that's helpful. Yeah. So the incumbent is vulnerable to crises during the election season, shall we say, or pre-election.
Well, it depends on the type of crisis. So something like a national security crisis, where people perceive a threat from, outside the U.S., then they usually rally behind the incumbent. But for something like this, that, the incumbent has some control over at least the management, right, of the crisis, right? Certainly, you can't really control how a pandemic unfolds completely, but because of certain things we know about public health and ways to mitigate spread of the virus, there's a perception, at least among the US public, that Trump hasn't done as good of a job as they would expect, and so he it's really harming his approval ratings in general, and then also with respect to this particular issue.
All right, so it's a complicated field, the study of the effect of crises.
Yes.
Now, what about the president's frequent attacks on the legitimacy of the voting process, which actually some people also would classify as a crisis? His attempts to undermine the validity of mail-in ballots, or his endorsement of voter fraud as a real and present danger, or his encouraging his supporters to serve as poll watchers. Do you think this rhetoric will affect turnout?
Well, that's a great question. There may be some mild mobilizing effects from both sides, right? So if his supporters, feel, some concern and buy into his claims, they may feel, that it's more important to turn out. And also on the other side, right, if you feel like democracy is under attack, right, that may be something that motivates, a certain percentage of the electorate to show up at the polls. But where this rhetoric is really having an even bigger impact is in how people are choosing to vote. So, in past research, there was actually very little difference between how Democrats and Republicans voted, whether it was in person, by absentee ballot. It didn't really vary by partisanship. But this election cycle, we're seeing an increasing partisan gap in how people want to vote. And that's grown over time. So what we're finding, I've been doing some research with collaborators at UC San Diego, as well as USC, and we're finding that, over time, many more Democrats are preferring vote by mail options for themselves and are more supportive of legislation or policies to allow, greater vote by mail than Republicans. And I think the gap we found in March was maybe a 10 percentage point gap in support. And that's grown to, I think in our last survey in August, it's grown to a 25 percentage point gap between Democrats and Republicans in preferences for mail ballot voting. And we find that Democrats are kind of more responsive to information. We've done some experiments where we provide information about when the next peak of the virus will be, and Democrats are more responsive to that information as well. And so there may be some slight turnout effects, but I think the bigger difference from a lot of Trump's rhetoric is in how people from the two parties are choosing to cast their ballot. But that can have important downstream consequences, right? If you have, I think the concern from many Democratic elites is, if Trump is sending rhetoric that is suggesting that these, ballots may be fraudulent, if it's vote by mail, and a lot of the votes cast for Biden are mail ballots, he's, kind of preempting and causing some concern about the legitimacy for these ballots. So it's really an issue that, people are paying careful attention to.
Right. Well, it may be a little bit unique to this cycle because the COVID is keeping the Democrats home because they're more likely to be concerned about the COVID. So possibly in the future, the two parties might converge again on using mail voting. But right now, it's actually a divisive issue.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about strategy. This is a longstanding question, and maybe it makes sense to think about it a little bit in terms of battleground states. So, what do you think is more important for Democrats? Should they try to lure Republicans and Americans who lean Republican away from Mr. Trump, or should they try to increase their turnout among Democrats and Americans who lean Democratic? Let's say, for example, in a place like Pennsylvania or Wisconsin, some of these northern battleground states, there are Democrats there, but there are also some Democrats that have started to lean Republican, so to speak. So what would be the better strategy? Trying to get the middle of the roaders, or just trying to increase voter turnout?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And that's, kind of the key question for any campaign and any given election cycle. And, part of the answer is it really depends. If we think back to, elections in the 1990s, the key really seemed to be persuasion, right? Trying to kind of get the other side to vote for you. But as we've kind of shifted to a more highly polarized political climate, there's been much more focus paid on getting your supporters to turn out. Now, when we're dealing with a presidential election, because they're state by state, kind of the answer to that question will vary depending on what the dynamics look like that in that particular state. So if kind of baseline preferences are such that, there are more Republicans in the state than Democrats, or, the parties are, so if there are more Republicans than Democrats, the focus will have to be on turning out your supporters, but then also highlighting and prioritizing some issues where you think, people from the other side will support you. And it's not that you have to highlight all issues, right, from the other side, but maybe somewhere there's actually little difference between the approaches. So something like the pandemic, everybody wants life to get back to normal. So if there are policies that might be agreed upon, right, you could highlight those types of policies that may bring the country closer to getting control of the pandemic and getting life back to normal. If you're in a state that's more evenly balanced, like pretty evenly divided bipartisan group, well, then you really want to focus on just getting your supporters to the polls and registering new supporters. And so it really just depends. And, we see this often state by state. Candidates will really think about, sometimes they'll focus on local issues, right, that aren't necessarily divisive, to try to get people from the other side to support them in particular states. And so because of the kind of odd nature we have of the Electoral College, campaigns need to kind of ask that question in each state they go to.
Yes, it's very interesting. So it's much more complex than it first appears, right? Okay, let's talk some about turnout. And I think it's hard to predict the outcome of an election, but it might be easier to predict a little bit about the turnout for specific groups. And I'd like to begin with Hispanics. And by Hispanics, I mean migrants from the Americas and their descendants, with the exception of Cubans, because Cubans are a special case, as everyone knows. So Hispanics who are eligible to vote, Jennifer, have a very low turnout relative to other groups, perhaps the lowest turnout of any ethnic group in the United States. Why is that?
Well, so there are two groups that have particularly low turnout when we think about race and ethnicity. So Hispanics are one, and Asian Americans are the other group, and their turnout is actually even lower than Hispanic turnout historically. And part of what drives that is, these are both immigrant-rooted communities. And so some are kind of newer to the US context, or newer generations. So for example, at least among Asians, it's also not every group, right? There's certain groups like that have connections to particular political parties. You gave the example of Cubans with Hispanics. But usually they're kind of socialized by parents who don't really have party attachments, let's say, right? Let's say your parents were not born in the US, they didn't grow up in the US political system. So as children, you're not socialized into, right, kind of the political parties, the political culture in the country. And so it takes a few more generations for people to develop those attachments to voting. And so we often see participation, is lower among immigrant rooted communities compared to those that have been in the US for more generations. And so that's part of why turnout is sometimes lower among, well, is at least on average lower among Latinos and Asian Americans compared to, right, other racial and ethnic groups in the US political context. So that's one. Some of it, of course, has to also do with resources. Individuals that have lower socioeconomic status are usually less likely to participate. And so that may also be a contributing factor for Hispanics, given their position, in society with respect to economics. Though it doesn't explain the puzzle of Asians, because they tend to have higher levels of SES relative to some other groups. But again, the socialization in a lot of Asian American political communities is pretty apolitical, right? To almost stay away from politics. So those are at least some of the kind of big picture reasons why we see lower levels of turnout among, those two groups.
Okay, well, that's very interesting. I didn't know that about Asians.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, in a recent New York Times op-ed, Ian Lopez, a UC Berkeley law professor, and Tori Gavito, a human rights lawyer, argued that because most Hispanics identify as white, they don't perceive Trump's racist rhetoric as directed against them. My own understanding of immigrants is that with the passage of time and generations, all groups show some tendency to distance themselves from their more recently arrived compatriots. For these reasons, Lopez and Gavito find that Hispanics are susceptible to pleas for law and order and not upset by strong condemnation of illegal immigrants. They conclude that a surprising number of Hispanics may not be averse to supporting Trump. Do you agree with this interpretation?
No, that's a great, kind of observation. And I actually want to provide a little more context to think back historically. So, Trump did receive a non-trivial percentage of the Latino vote. However, he's not the first Republican candidate to do so. Latinos as a group, just like many other groups, they're not monolithic in their political preferences. And so, for much of US history, Republican presidential candidates have received anywhere from kind of a quarter to a third of the Latino vote. Kind of the peak was when George W. Bush was running for president and secured 44% of the Latino vote in 2004. So you do have a, pretty high percentage of Latinos who are Republican Party identifiers. And that's been a tradition, for many election cycles. And so, what we know about partisanship being such a strong influence on voting decisions, we shouldn't expect support to go down too much, even given, right, some of Donald Trump's rhetoric, because they have longstanding ties to the Republican Party, for many reasons, such as similarity in values, political preferences, at least among the subset that's, attracted to the Republican Party. So, with those folks that support the Republican Party, it would be pretty hard to peel them off because they are party identifiers.
And there's the conservative social values. Yes, so some are quite observant Catholics. Yes, so they may be more supportive of Trump's religious attitudes and than the Democrats, or maybe they would oppose abortion, things like that.
Yeah, so that would be some of the kind of values of the Republican Party that would fit very well with at least a subset of the Latino electorate that, right, care deeply about some of those issues.
Right. All right. Well, it sounds like perhaps predicting Hispanics is particularly challenging. What about African Americans? What is your sense about what African Americans may bring to the voting booth this year?
Yeah, this has been such a really important and interesting year, especially, thinking about African American voters. Um, this is a group that does turn out at much higher rates. And, in most academic studies, once you control for kind of differences in socioeconomic status, African Americans turn out at pretty much similar rates as whites, and sometimes more so, right? So, for example, thinking back to 2008, and this is a cycle where African Americans, especially given the salience of racial issues, are very energized, and have been, of course, we've seen protests happening in the U.S. for around Black Lives Matter, and that has expanded to include many other groups that have been protesting with the Black Lives Matter movement. And so I suspect that turnout will be higher among African Americans this cycle because of the salience of racial issues, because of Donald Trump's attacks on the Black Lives Matter movement, right? So he is, also attacking the group that sometimes can be mobilizing. You also have, of course, the first Black woman vice presidential nominee. And so you could see role model effects where, people are inspired by Kamala Harris being the VP candidate. And so they'll be more inspired to turn out to vote. And so we may see an uptick in African-American turnout this cycle relative to 2016. It may not reach the same level as 2008 and 2012, but with racial issues being salient, Kamala Harris on the ticket, and just 4 years of a Trump presidency and what that means for a lot of people of color, I think they'll be particularly mobilized this cycle.
Okay. What about young adults? Well, I'm still on this matter of turnout. Generally, turnout tends also to be low among the young. I wonder if you could tell us why that is and what we can expect this year and what happens as young people get older. Do they vote more?
Yeah, no, that's another great question. And, one that people are often concerned with, especially given the low participation of young people. And a lot of that, it's pretty costly to, when you're thinking about young people, right? Your first election, kind of what's involved in that process, right? Kind of learning how to register to vote, kind of figuring out the information you need to vote. That's a pretty high barrier. And what we know is that over time that gets easier. So the more elections that you vote in, you build almost a habit of voting, right? Just like you would, let's say you like to exercise, right? You build a habit of going a few times a week. Voting is kind of like that too. So, over time, what we usually see is, yes, turnout is a little bit lower among young people, but over the course of their lifespan, it increases. Now, thinking about the current context, the other thing we know is that, well, young people turned out at higher rates than they ever had before in the midterm elections. So in 2018, that's usually, midterms are usually lower turnout events than certainly presidential contexts, but they were really mobilized. So we saw pretty big turnout increases in that election cycle. Many young people have been engaged in many of the protests that are happening throughout the country and have been going on. So they're more energized than usual. So I do suspect that in the coming election, we will see higher turnout for this group as we did in the midterm election.
So just in terms of history here, the young people in terms of the Clinton-Trump race, they had obviously been highly energized by Bernie. Then Bernie did not make the general election. How did young people perform 4 years ago? And are you expecting more or less or the same this time?
Yeah, they didn't. They were not as energized. My recollection, I'd have to double check the exact percentages, but my recollection was they weren't as energized as when Obama was running. In part for some of the reasons you mentioned, right? Many were Bernie supporters. But that they rebounded in terms of their performance in the midterm cycle, as I mentioned. So kind of once they kind of saw the consequences of what, elections have consequences. And so policies change depending on what side of the political spectrum you're on. That could be a good thing or a bad thing. And for many young people who tend to lean more to the left, being more supportive of Bernie, and then a few years into a Trump presidency, they became very concerned about his presidency and turned out in 2018. And so I would expect we'll see a similar thing in 2020 where their turnout is higher than it usually is. And that may be extended even more so, especially with, we do know that something like, mail ballots are ones where young people often prefer that voting method. And so many states, in California, it's always been pretty easy to be a permanent absentee voter, but in other states where they're also making it much easier, that will of course help young people and maybe more appealing to how, for them casting a ballot.
Oh, that's a great insight, actually, because depending on the state or maybe even with the county, there are all kinds of confusions about whether you must vote at home or whether you're a registered voter or you're in your college community, and whether or not there's any voting booths on campus or not. So yes, mail-in ballots would be an excellent way to increase young people's participation. I don't know how many, do you have any idea how many states? We know that California is sending every one of us a ballot, but is that a very popular strategy or not? It must be costly.
It is. Let's see, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, and I was just reading something earlier today with the actual numbers. I think it may be close to, I don't know, 9 or 10 states that are, and I could be wrong, that are automatically mailing everyone a ballot. Other states have made it much easier to request a mail ballot. And so I think at least 3/4 of the states have made it easier to request a mail ballot. But, there are several states that are just automatically doing it, like California.
Right. All right, let's move on to gender, which is one of your areas of expertise. Biden is doing better among women than men, but still one might wonder about some of the dynamics behind it. So one question that we have is, did he improve his electability by adding a woman to the ticket in general, and more specifically by picking Kamala?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. It's a little bit tricky in the sense that, women, many women, not all women, there's a lot of, women who are Republican and will, continue to vote for Donald Trump. But at least, in 2018, for example, college educated women were those who turned out in really great numbers, just like young people, and were in part responsible for the blue wave. And I don't know how different their behavior would be if he didn't nominate a woman, right? It's kind of an open, we don't have the counterfactual. They likely would have voted Democratic anyway. That said, they may be much more enthusiastic with his pick of Kamala Harris. They may be more likely to do things like display signs in their yards or make calls for the campaign. So they may be more active in a lot of the things that campaigns need people to do with his pick of Kamala Harris. But in most academic studies of the effect of, the vice presidential pick, often the findings are pretty marginal to not really having much effect at all. Now, to be fair, a lot of those studies are looking at effects in general and not looking at, right, how a pick affects a particular subgroup of the electorate, like women or African Americans. But on average, usually the effects are pretty marginal. But of course, in a context like we have, which is highly polarized, where the parties are pretty, close. They're kind of been neck and neck in a lot of the election cycles, right? It could go either way. Changes at the margins can be, important. And so, if the pick of Kamala is energizing more women to be engaged, then that could be really important for the campaign.
So you already mentioned then that you hypothesize that that African Americans may be energized by Kamala.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, not even African Americans. I mean, it could be a combo. It could be, the advantage to Kamala is that she has appeal across a broad range of groups, right? So women may be enthusiastic about her, especially women of color, right? We know a lot of times people are particularly enthusiastic when it's someone that, kind of matches both race and gender. African Americans may be inspired by her, and she also may inspire the Asian American political community because of her Indian roots. So, so she could, mobilize and, cause a lot of groups to be more enthusiastic about the election.
Right. Yeah. I would just say, actually, my own sense with respect to Asian Americans, however, is that actually they're an extremely diverse group. So I would imagine that Indian Americans might be rather more energized by her presence than, I don't know, Filipinos or something like that. So my own feeling would be that it's the African American component that will be, that's the largest base that is the most important. I don't know to what extent her presence will bring out those who might not have otherwise voted. I like your suggestion that maybe they will just show more enthusiasm rather than actually, bringing them out. Can you think of any constituents that Biden may have lost? Or does your research, you have done research, as I mentioned at the outset, you've done a little research on the effect of Sarah Palin and Hillary Clinton's experience. So could you talk to, are there some constituents in the United States that are turned off when a woman is running for president or vice president?
Yeah, so, some of the research I've done, other existing research suggests that, if Biden is at risk of losing any groups with the pick of Kamala Harris, it might be those who are higher in kind of sexist attitudes, that happen to still identify as Democrats, or those with more conservative racial attitudes. Those are groups where, they may be less hesitant, to support the Democratic nominee. Now, it's less clear if they're less likely to do so when the vice presidential candidate is a woman of color, right? The person still at the top of the ticket is a white male who's been in politics for a very long time, and has, a reputation for being kind of, a relatable guy, right? Everyone knows Joe. He makes people feel good, so it's not clear that they would necessarily leave the party. But if there's any group that's at risk of doing so, it would most likely be those who have more sexist views and, more negative racial attitudes.
So your research would not, does not suggest that that John McCain lost votes as a result of picking Sarah Palin?
No, because it's a little bit it is somewhat complicated because the role of gender, it also depends on the extent to which women running kind of fit certain expectations about women, right? Women in life, women in political life. And so, they may be supportive of a female candidate who kind of embodies traditional roles of being a woman, and projects that. And so in some respects, Sarah Palin did project that, right? She had an identity as a hockey mom. She played up being a mom. She held very conservative views on a lot of issues that were consistent with, those who may hold more traditional gender attitudes. And so she's wasn't perceived as a threat. And in fact, many really, the Republican Party, thought very highly of her. And she was very mobilizing for certain groups. So it's not that, and of course there are not as many Republican women in Congress, but, there's certainly Republican women who win office. But part of it does depend on the extent to which, their presentation of self is consistent with more traditional notions of gender versus if they seem, more of a threat to existing gender dynamics.
So would you, if I could just push you further, since we have a little more time, so would you then argue that some of this presentation of self stuff did Elizabeth Warren in?
Well, I think the tricky thing for Elizabeth Warren was, first, it's really hard to run in a crowded field. So it's, there were so many candidates running. Second, I think, at least from polling data, Democrats were primarily, most concerned with who could win the election. And they were just still concerned from the 2016 election, right? If Hillary Clinton, like one of the most qualified people to run for the office, lost to Trump, who, you know, didn't have those same qualifications. You know, why would we expect Elizabeth Warren to do any better, right? And so I think that was the concern on many minds. Even though she was very well liked, right? She always had, you know, very high favorability ratings. But I think that concern with electability this cycle was probably the biggest problem, you know, for her campaign.
Right. That's tough being a woman in this game. There's no question.
Yes, yeah.
Uh, okay, well, let me ask one last question about women. This comes from one of our members. Do social scientists have any general sense of the ways in which a presidential candidate's spouse affects his or her electability? In particular, do you have an opinion about Dr. Jill Biden's effect on her husband's candidacy?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's not a ton of research on the effect of spouses in political science. There have been a few studies, usually that look at when there's someone already in office, so the effect of first ladies on presidents and their approval ratings and favorability ratings. And so what we know from some of that research is that usually first ladies have pretty high approval ratings. You know, often they take on roles that are not as political. And so the exception to that rule, so when first ladies get more negative ratings, are when they kind of take a more active policy role, such as Hillary Clinton, you know, when Bill Clinton was in office. And what, you know, some of this research suggests that there is a benefit from spouses in the sense that, you know, if they're viewed very favorably, so for example, Michelle Obama has always, at least the last, maybe not at the very beginning when Barack Obama was running for office, but certainly once he was in office, she had very high favorability ratings, you know, and that served to actually improve evaluations of Obama. Researchers have found this in the past for other leaders. And so, you know, they can be a real asset on the campaign trail, especially if they're viewed very positively, at least for incumbents. And that may extend, right, to candidates as well. It's a little bit harder when people don't know the candidate very well, because then if they don't know the candidate well, they probably certainly don't know their spouse very well. So with respect to Dr. Jill Biden, it's a little bit unclear in the sense that, you know, she's a little better known because Joe Biden was vice president, but still not by a very large percentage of the population. And one of the tricky things this election cycle is there's not as many campaign events to meet Dr. Biden, right? And so, you know, she may have less of an impact, you know, just because there's less, you know, there are fewer opportunities for exposure this cycle with, you know, fewer campaign events. So, so I suspect it would be a pretty small effect, but for those who know her, my sense is she has pretty high likability ratings, just given, you know, most of the work she's done have been things like supporting military families, right, being a big advocate for education. And so that would resonate very well and very positively with people.
But your message to any spouse, I guess, regardless of gender, is that person needs to stay out of the Oval Office.
Well, I don't know that I would say that, but only if they want to help with favorability ratings.
Yeah. Well, I remember years ago that Jimmy Carter wanted to have Rosalind attend some cabinet meetings or whatever. Evidently, you know, she was a pretty smart cookie. And the pushback was just enormous. It was considered wildly inappropriate for him to, you know, try to put her in the loop at all. It's interesting because, you know, in the Kennedy case, although, I mean, I think there was some pushback, but the fact of the matter was that the whole family was essentially, of course, they were all male,
right,
able to run the government. So maybe there's some double standards here. You think? Okay, moving along. Before and on election day, what do you expect in the way of voter suppression? And after election day, what do you expect in the way of post-election disruption?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. You know, I expect that we'll see some of the things we always, you know, have seen in the last few cycles in terms of voter suppression. we may see, we've already been seeing the elimination of polling places, right? In many communities, there's fewer polling places, which poses a challenge, especially for communities that, may need polling place options that are closer to them, especially if they don't have, let's say, their own vehicle to travel to a polling location. In some communities, and this would be especially in, let's say, Native American communities, it's not uncommon that, people would have to, commute, really extensive, an extensive way to just get to a polling booth. And so, that is something that's, we want to be concerned with in the lead up. We've also seen, some states will remove people from voting lists if it's been a while before they, since they voted. And so there are these, a number of cases of wrongful removal from the voting list, and that can cause problems. And then, of course, there's just intimidation outside polling places. So one of the examples you brought up earlier, right, about Trump encouraging supporters to be monitoring polling locations, that may, be some concern if some groups are intimidated by their presence. So, and then there's also sometimes mailers, right, that campaigns will send in advance of elections that will, be aimed at intimidating voters from going to the polls. Things like, we're going to check ID, we're going to check this. And so it discourages voters from going to the polls. So those are things, of course, that we'll want to keep our eye on. And I expect to still, occur. But I think the biggest concern this cycle will be, also what we talked about earlier, which is mail voting, the way, the ballots cast through mail voting are handled, how they're, whether they're perceived as legitimate. And it will also depend on, how close the race is. Will the ballots that are, people send in by mail, will they be counted in time? Right? These are all really important questions. So I think that's why you see a lot of groups really encouraging people that are voting by mail to vote early, get your ballot in to make sure that it is counted. LA County is doing something where you can kind of track your ballot through the process to make sure it's received. So that can lend some confidence to voters. There will be kind of boxes where people can drop off their ballot. And so that, if you're worried, people are worried at all about the Postal Service and some of the attacks against the Postal Service, will their ballot get there in time? There will be these kind of drop off boxes. And there's, of course, vote centers where you can go to drop off your ballot. And so, the earlier people do that, the better, because you don't want to risk whether, votes are not counted because they don't get there in time. And so how big of an issue it is, I guess, in some, I think depends a lot on how close the election is. If it's a close election, it could be, it could be pretty ugly, just like it was, back in 2000, where, there was a court case. There were weeks where people were kind of investigating ballots. I don't know if everyone remembers hanging chads, dimple chads, right?
Absolutely.
So we may be in, a situation like that. But again, if one candidate wins by a wide margin, I suspect it won't really be much of, it won't be a big issue. It will just be if it's a pretty tight race. So.
Okay, well, let me ask you one last question. So you've pretty much brought us up to the present. But I think what we're also aware, I mean, when you describe, people having to travel long distances and things like this, our electoral institutions have really become dysfunctional. Many states have insufficient equipment, outdated equipment, confusing directives. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about what could be done to improve the situation. And in thinking about that, I mean, the fact is we've actually known for months, if not years, that we have a dysfunctional electoral infrastructure. We know that, and yet nothing has been done. Is there some way that we can move forward, keeping in mind that the United States is also unique in that voting is organized at the state level. It's not funded sufficiently at the federal level. So is there any way out of this morass, or do you not think so?
It's really hard because, right, there's so many demands on, the budget, right, and what people want out of the budget. And so, it can be difficult to make the case that we need to update, equipment. That's not necessarily at the top of many voters' minds, but the more that voters care about these things, right, then it's more likely that elected officials will pay attention to those concerns. And so part of the key is really, almost an information campaign for voters to understand why it's really important to invest in infrastructure, that it protects our democracy, that it's really foundational. Because if voters aren't making that demand on elected officials, they're going to have pressure to allocate money in other ways. So now there have been some developments, of course, since 2016, at least at the national level, but also at the state and local level. Leaders are paying more attention into election infrastructure because of concern about the security of our process. But that, as you mentioned, we've known there have been issues for a long time. And it wasn't until, right, kind of, attempts by Russia to interfere with our election that people started to pay, more attention to it. So there's a little bit of momentum, but if voters are also caring about these issues, it could push it, forward more to actually have deeper investment.
Well, that's a great point. I really appreciate that. That's an excellent insight. It's very difficult to imagine where the push is going to come from. It's not quite as difficult as campaign finance, but in a way, it's kind of similar. And also the case that whatever the flaws in the system, the people that are in power got there through it. So they're somewhat less incentivized to try to move ahead. Well, I want to thank you very much. Concerned Citizens also wants to thank you for taking time from your extremely busy schedule to talk with us. And we want to thank you, our audience, for watching this broadcast. As long as the shutdown persists, Concerned Citizens Presents will continue recording programs for your in-home enjoyment. Please join us for another episode soon.